and thank you again for that lovely introduction. Yes, thank you. It's great. My name is Chris Wild. I'm an author and campaigner for young people and children in care. Why do I do what I do? Why do I write books? Well, I'm care experienced. And I always go back to the beginning. So my story is slightly different because I'm able to articulate my experience quite well. A lot of people who I started out with in life didn't make it. And I would say I'm one of the lucky ones. And I don't feel guilty about using that word, I'm one of the lucky ones, because I was born into a world of love. And people say, what's love? And for me, love is being born into a world, a family which is stable, which has security. You know, that was my world. That was the world I was introduced to. I had a mom, I had a dad. I didn't know about any of the iniquities of the world, all the evils that existed out there. I had food on the table every day. I had Christmas, we went on holiday, we went abroad. So to be born into that world, I would say that's very lucky, wouldn't you? It's a world of love. And we know hundreds of thousands of children all over the world, millions, don't get that experience. So if you have that experience, you're very lucky. So I always use that word, lucky. I don't feel ashamed about using that word. I was very lucky. I had amazing parents who doted on me and my sister. We were protected, didn't know anything about the world, the evil stuff out there. And my dad was so cautious because my dad was born in the care sector himself, and it's something I didn't know until I was an adult. My dad was very protective, and the reason he was protective of that is because he didn't want us to be affected by it. He didn't want that vortex where, you know, my dad was a care leaver himself, and that means, you know, that's my pathway, that's my trajectory. And so my parents protected us from that. And my story changes. It begins when I'm 11 years old. Because I come home from school one day and my dad caught chicken pox. Now, he got that from my sister. Now, my dad having chicken pox was like a really deadly cancer. You know, he didn't have an immune system. I mean, all cancer's deadly, but for my dad, it was quick. Chicken pox, you think that's no big deal. But in 2 weeks of getting chicken pox, my dad was on a life support machine. And then on the 1st of April, 1991, I was at home at my grandma's house and we got a phone call, and I ran to the phone and I picked up the phone, and it was my Uncle Gary, who was at the hospital with my dad. And he says, put your mum on the phone. He says, no, why? I said, how's my dad? He said, your dad's dead. And I'm thinking, April Fools? 12 o'clock? It's not 12 o'clock yet. You're having a joke, aren't you? He said, no, your dad is dead. And I just remember going into that kind of silent mode and then looking at my mom, and my mom runs to the phone, and my mom collapses. And then that for me was my first introduction to trauma. I never known what trauma was before. I never known pain like that before. I didn't think it was real. So for somebody to tell you your dad, your hero, is dead, it's like, no, I don't know what death is. And I didn't know what death was, because I kept thinking days after that, he was going to come home. You know, the car was still there. The clothes still smelt of him. He used to wear Brut. You know, I wear Brut now for that reason. But I used to wear Brut, and that smell was potent in the house. So thinking, oh, when is he coming back from this death? But he never came back, obviously. But what happens then is everything dysfunctional starts in a functional setting, I would say. And our lives just kind of became fractured overnight. My mom, being very young herself, didn't know how to cope with this herself, so she started drinking because she had 2 kids to raise. She just lost the love of her life. My sister was slightly older than I, 2 years older, so she was 13, just transitioning into a teenager. She couldn't cope with that environment, so she went to stay with my grandparents. But I felt protective. I wanted to be with my mom, because mom was getting drunk, so, you know, on a night time, my mom would be unconscious on the floor, and as a young man, you want to protect her, don't you? You make sure she's okay. But mom met somebody rather quick, because I could understand that she was yearning that loss. There was something there which wasn't right for her, a void. So this new man came into her life, but this new man was nothing like my dad. He was violent. He was manipulative. He was just a horrible person. Nothing like my dad. My dad was kind, gentle. He was a hero. Everybody loved my dad. So then, from having that trauma of losing your dad, you've got that trauma then of your mom who's drinking loads of alcohol, coming home, you see her unconscious. This new man comes into her life, and he's violent. And seeing my mum with black eye and stuff, and it's like, I never witnessed anything like this. So you can imagine that change in worlds, kind, love, gentle, hardship, violence, just fear, a different kind of fear. So yes, so that environment became really toxic for me, and I gravitated towards other young men in that area who I didn't know exist. And you don't do it. I mean, the only way to articulate that, if you're trying to kind of get that vision in your head, like Oliver Twist when he meets Fagin and Artful Dodger, that became kind of my escapism, my serene, my haven. Like when you see young lads now all together and you think they're up to no good. Not really. For me, that was my escapism. I just needed to be with these kind of guys. So that's when I first got introduced to young people who didn't have parents, young people who were in the care system. I remember the boys telling me they were in children's homes. I'm thinking, that sounds great. What is that? Sounds all right, laughter. Is that what? You can do what you want. You can do this. You can do that for. Well, that's the kind of place I want to be. But funny enough, it became a reality for me because what was happening, I was getting arrested all the time, not because I was the criminal of the year, but imagine at 11 years old when you work with young people and you've had that kind of trauma, you don't know how to kind of express yourself. There's no kind of book which says this is how you deal with trauma at 11 years old, and your brain's frazzled. So breaking a window, you feel good. You're exerting that negative energy. Not because you want to be a bad boy, you want to be a nuisance. That kid on the street who's always causing trouble. That kid on the street causing trouble, he's causing trouble for a reason. And that was me. I didn't want to cry. I didn't know how to express and say, I am in pain. So smashing windows was my way of expressing that. But then what happens? You get arrested, don't you? The police bring you back home. They kept bringing me back home and see mom unconscious or mom with a black eye. And the police have got to report that, and rightly so, because it becomes a safeguarding issue. And then a social worker got involved. Never had a social worker before, didn't know what one was. This woman came to the house. She met my mom. She spoke to me. She could see something wasn't right. I was in court 3 times a week for petty things. I mean, we're all about the right age to remember W.H. Smiths and Woolworths and going into Woolworths and grabbing the sweets because they used to be right by the door, so you could go in and grab the pick and mix and run off. But I always got caught. So I wasn't a very good at it. Even the judge used to look at me and go, "You're not very good at this, are you?" And I go, "No, I'm not actually." But I didn't do it for that reason. I did it because I needed to tell people I'm in pain. A decision was made, and rightly so. Home wasn't safe. I've accepted that. It was violent. It was traumatic. So a decision was made that I'd go into a children's home. Now, not just any children's home. This was a children's home called Skirkit Lodge, and it was in Halifax. And this home was built in the 70s, and it was built specifically to exploit children. It was run by paedophiles. Now, the world has changed, and rightly so. There was no DBS checks or anything in the 70s. There was no Ofsted. There was no regulator. So these places, anybody could get a job there. And they did. The head of Children's Services was a prolific paedophile, and he was from Hertfordshire. And he employed all the other paedophiles from all over the country, literally Birmingham, from Hull, Leeds, all the way down to the bottom of Croydon. These people came together in this little village in Halifax to work in a children's home. Social workers, care workers, key workers, all in this house. Now, I didn't know that, of course. I thought it was great because being taken away from that environment, which was horrible, and just, for me, I didn't want to witness that kind of abuse. But ironically, I was going into a place which was worse. But when you go to these places, at first it looks great. There's this vision of kind of safety and security, and that's what a children's home is, isn't it? It's a home, isn't it? That's why they call it a home. And it looked like that at first. When the social worker picked me up, she took me to the children's home. Everybody was outside of this place greeting me, saying, "Welcome to Skirkit Lodge." I thought, well, this is great. It's like a holiday camp. All my mates are here. We can do whatever we want. But then it quickly changed. And I always use this expression. To this day, I can remember seeing children with dead eyes. Now, people say, what does that mean? If we work in this industry, we probably understand that. Children with life have got blue eyes, but blue turns to grey, green turns to black, and that's because of trauma. And, if you go into it neurologically and all that kind of stuff, you realise that your eyes can become discoloured from trauma. And I'd witnessed that in that children's home. That's the first thing I remember. These kids who should have been full of life, who should have been happy and looking like the world is their oyster, per se, but they weren't. They were just emaciated. They were scared. They lacked any soul. And that bothered me at first. I thought, that's not right. But not being able to understand that or comprehend it at that age. The second day in the children's home, I was making toast. And I didn't butter the bread properly because it's just toast in it. And I got smacked by the manager of the house. He hit me around the ear, and it's the first time I've been smacked properly by an adult. And you start got ringing in your ear. And then I realised I'm in a dangerous place here. This is not a place of love, care, and attention, security, and safety. Then when that happened, I realised other things in the house, like they had a game with the staff, like when you were walking on the corridors, they'd hit you with a bat, and if you went down straight away, you'd get like 10 points, and they had a chart in the staff room. So if you got hit and that kid went straight down, they said, well done, it's a hole in one. And it was games to them. It was just games of abusing us and kicking us and spitting at us. There was no one there to say any different. There was no Ofsted. If you told your social worker, you were a liar. I got dragged into a lock room, lots of privilege. It was a little room like that. It used to be a cubby hole. And they used to lock you in there, leave you there all day, 8 hours without any food and drink. Now that sounds like something you watch or read about in Oliver Twist. But this is 1992 for an 11-year-old boy. That kind of abuse. Girls couldn't wear underwear. That was one of the policies in his children's home. You could not wear underwear. There was no curtains on the windows. You ask why? Because you couldn't hang yourself. Door handles from inside the dorms were removed. So on the night time when you went to bed, you couldn't get out. Only people could get in. So it's a house of horrors. I'm not going to go into great detail, but you get the picture, don't you? That was a children's home in the 90s where young boys like me were supposed to get support. They were supposed to get help. It didn't exist. Now, I use that word lucky, serendipity. I don't know what it was. But because I wasn't hand selected to be there, as you know, social workers send referrals. These people look through the referrals. They see already, but this kid's come from a very traumatic background where he's been sexually abused. He's perfect for us. This kid's got no mum and dad. No one's going to come sniffing around. I wasn't that referral. My grandma was still about. She was turning up at the children's home. They knew I was a liability. They didn't want people like me there. The court sent me there. And they didn't want me there. It was respite at the beginning, but I was still hanging around with older boys within the area, and they were telling me stories like, oh, you've got to get out of there because they'll do stuff to you. But again, at 11 years old, you don't understand what rape and abuse is, do you? It just seems like, whatever that is, sounds horrible. And I had a social worker, and he was quite well known as his social worker to the other boys, and he had this fear factor about him. I could see when he turned up, all the other boys just changed, their demeanour changed, their personalities changed. It's very violent, very big, this guy. He was my social worker, and he told me one day that we were going to go to the moors for treasure hunting. Now, treasure hunting was a hidden term for child rape. And I remember telling one of the older boys, but this is I'm going to go to treasure hunting with my social worker. Says, don't go. Because if you go, your life will change forever. Your life will change forever. Now, I didn't go. I ran away that day and never went back to that children's home. Nobody came looking for me. I was 12 years old, living on the streets. Older boys, obviously became quite vulnerable in a different way. It became useful. It became valuable, from vulnerable to valuable. That's what happens to young boys, because you can make money for older boys. They can use you for drug dealing, for burgling, for doing this and that. But there was an essence of family about that. I felt safe in that environment, and that's the paradox, isn't it? A children's home is supposed to keep you safe, but I felt safer on the streets. I felt safer sleeping in paper bins, in Tesco's. I felt safer walking the streets at night time, just having total freedom to do whatever you want, just to be a young boy. But obviously, the older boys didn't want me doing that either. They didn't to make sure that I was there. And, you know, we talk about county lines. County lines has been around forever. It's been around for a long time. I used to get sent all places around the country, Yorkshire, not the country, north of England, with rucksacks to deliver on trains, and they'd send me with another adult and say, if anybody asks you questions, that's your uncle and you're going to go and see someone. I never questioned it at all because I was looked after. I was given 20 Regal cigarettes. I had a